All right, hello again. In this video, what we're going to dive into is really turning now from understanding broad patterns of diversity in insects and the relationship between diversity, ecosystem services, and human well-being to now really specifically thinking about how global environmental change, so the many ways in which we are changing the environment, might be impacting insects. So what we're going to do is first sort of go through some of the most important, by no means exhaustive, but covering many of the sort of most important aspects of environmental change, and then walking through the ways in which the many sort of responses that insects might have to those stressors. So first starting to think about global environmental change and what it means for insects. And critically, we are changing the environment in many, many, many ways that all act often in concert to impact insects. So what are some of the most important and what are some of the effects that we know have the biggest impacts on insects? So one that we've sort of now got really strong evidence that it can have important ecological effects is the global movement of species. So there are many, many examples of this, but our movement, either intentional, as we've seen some examples of, for example, for biological control, systems moving natural enemies, for example, from Australia to California. So either intentional movement or accidental migration of species across countries or continents can have really big impacts on the sort of endemic communities in many parts of the world. So one example of this is from down in Patagonia, where there's actually the largest bumblebee in the world, Bombus dalbamii. And this was really an incredibly common species, and this is an example we actually already see earlier in the semester. So this is really a ecologically dominant species. But then a couple of alternative bumblebee species, Bombus ruderatus and then Bombus terrestris, were introduced for commercial pollination originally to Chile, and then ended up taking over in sort of this rapid ecological succession, where really just in the course of a few years, the native population was essentially replaced by first ruderatus and now terrestris. So essentially complete turnover from one dominant species to an invasive species. And Bombus dalbamii is still around, but in really limited populations and pockets still. In addition to movement of species, of course, the extent and ways in which we are changing landscapes is critically important for insects. So now roughly half of the terrestrial surface on the planet is devoted to agriculture, and that's risen dramatically in the past century or so, and is actually sort of not changed enormously in the half century, but in terms of extent. So we're not adding a lot of cropland globally, but the ways in which we are farming have changed dramatically. So there's both over the past, in the sort of Anthropocene, in the era of human-driven environmental change, we saw an earlier phase of expansion of agriculture. And now in more recent years, we've seen a sort of intensification of the ways in which agriculture is managed within those landscapes. Chemical pollution, of course, is an incredibly important impact on and change to the abiotic environment across the globe. So much of this is through that intensification within agricultural landscapes. So the advent of synthetic chemical inputs, both in terms of fertilizer, but also herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides, have introduced a lot of novel chemistry into the environment, but also microplastics, all kinds of there are tens of thousands novel chemicals, synthetic chemicals that have been introduced and approved for widespread use. And often we know very little about the impacts of these compounds on biological systems generally and insects in particular. So widespread changes to the sort of chemical environment and chemical pollution is widespread across the globe, really. And of course, another familiar one that is the impact of climate change on insect populations. So not only are we seeing, of course, a steady increase from greenhouse gas emissions in the global mean temperature, but also important impacts on the variability, the sort of extremes and variation around those means. And those can really have important effects at small scales on insects. So those are just a sort of few examples, but by no means exhaustive examples of the ways in which we are changing the environment that could have really dramatic effects on insects. And one really important thing to note, though, is that these often don't act independently. So insects are exposed to multiple stressors or novel anthropogenic changes simultaneously, whether that's, for example, the physical changes in landscape along with exposure to novel agrochemicals. So a lot of these happen in concert and can either add up or actually act sometimes synergistically, so that the effect of combined stressors is worse than even just the independent effects of those stressors combined. So just to flesh that out a little bit, one interesting recent example of that actually looked at the effects of climate anomalies. So basically the effect of climate changes on insect abundance and richness here. So on the graph on the left is showing effects of temperature anomalies on the x-axis. The effects of those temperature anomalies on the left graph, abundance, and on the right, species richness. So as we talked about in the last video, just the number of different species. And what these graphs are showing is those trends, but broken out by different landscape types. So here in the green on top of both of these graphs, we see sort of intact primary vegetation and a sort of gradient of land use change down to, in the darker red on the bottom in both, high intensity agriculture. And so the thing to notice here is that actually the effects of, in both graphs, the effects of temperature are neutral or maybe even slightly positive in intact native vegetation. So increased temperature, which might, for example, add energy to the system and can be beneficial for some insects, seems to have maybe a net benefit potentially in primary intact natural habitat. However, in high-intensity agricultural landscapes, there are strong negative effects of that temperature. And there are a couple hypotheses for this. One is that the physical simplification of landscapes might make the effects of climate sort of more extreme. So in natural habitat, where you have lots of trees and vegetation absorbing energy, you might have buffered impacts of temperature, and also you might have micro habitats where insects can find refuge during heat waves. But out in high-intensity agricultural landscapes, the exposure to those, for example, heat waves might be more extreme. So one way in which the land use change actually affects the sensitivity to climate, or another way to think about that is the effect that climate is going to have might actually depend on land use transformation. So just one example of how these multiple ways in which we are changing the environment don't act independently, but actually act in concert, and sometimes can sort of synergize or make the effects of each worse. Okay, so given that really just rough overview of the ways in which we are changing the environment that might be relevant for insects, what they do, and their diversity across the globe, how might species respond to that? So what are the different ways in which species can either cope with or fail to cope with those changes? So one rough category of these would be to maybe adjust. So we can think of this as sort of plasticity, and we'll walk through some examples of these in the coming slides. But in general, sort of cope with it, whether through behavior or developmental plasticity. That you don't necessarily need any special tools, but insects might just be able to cope with some degree of change. Insects, of course, can also move where they are. So you're probably familiar with predictions and some evidence for example, range shifts as the climate that might be suitable for a particular species. If as it gets warmer, the suitable habitat might be moving, for example, toward the poles or up mountains, and species can move to sort of track that shift in optimal sort of habitat consistent with their abiotic niche. So species can move. They can also adapt. So instead of just sort of maybe plastic coping or behavioral adjustments, species might also be able to evolve new ecological performance and adapt to the novel changes in the environment, especially in systems where evolution works quickly and might be able to keep pace with these environmental changes. And we'll talk through some examples of that. Of course, the final option is if you can't adjust, move, or adapt, then species might die. So either go through full extinction or local extirpation. Okay, so what evidence, or maybe we can walk through some examples of each of these responses. So one option for adjustment, this obviously is not an insect, but I think a really nice example of bears doing quite well sometimes is a black bear doing quite well in an urban environment. So sometimes animals have developed a lot of behavioral adaptations and plasticity that allow them to be flexible in different environments, and they can sometimes apply those cognitive capacities to novel environments. So some species just thrive in novel environments, maybe even without any evolution, but just with built-in cognitive flexibility. And in insects, we can think about examples of, for example, thermoregulation, being able to find, when we talk about that example we gave earlier of the interaction between landscapes and climate, the ability to find locally optimal temperature environments could allow insects to, even within a landscape, sort of track their own optimal environment and buffer their own exposure. So some behavioral flexibility adjustments. There's also developmental plasticity that can have important effects. So many mechanisms in which insects might just be able to adjust in response to these novel conditions. Of course, movement is also an important option. So for example, this is really a projection, but we also have lots of evidence that insects are indeed tracking novel conditions as they shift. There are exceptions to this, and there's also clear evidence that insects are not always able to track with these novel shifts, but indeed we expect some range shift and sort of migration. There's strong evidence in some systems that this is indeed happening. Of course, we can also think about the capacity to evolve. And one of the, I think, great examples of this, we might not think of, but as sort of beneficial evolution, but from the species perspective, this is fantastic, is the example of evolution of resistance to pesticides, right? So from this Colorado potato beetle's perspective, they're a species just trying to survive, and of course they're targeted with widespread insecticide use, but have somewhat remarkable capacity, including mechanisms identified by researchers here in the Department of Entomology at UW-Madison, and even some graduate students in your class working on this system, but really a remarkable ability to rapidly evolve in just decades or less to exposure to these novel insecticides. So many, and this is just one of many examples where indeed rapid evolution to novel environmental conditions seems to be facilitating species' ability to exist in place without having to shift ranges. In this case, maybe an example we don't like, but really a remarkable example of rapid evolution. And of course, species might also just go extinct. And there are several examples of this from insects. So obviously one of the famous examples from vertebrates is the passenger pigeon. It was largely hunted to extinction. But within insects, the Xerces blue is one of the canonical examples, and actually the Xerces Society for Insect Conservation was named after the Xerces blue species of Lycaenid that lived in the sand dunes in San Francisco and went extinct due to habitat loss in the 1940s. So, and then we have, of course, in many species that are in critically endangered, including one you might be familiar with here is the rusty patch bumblebee, Bombus affinis, a once abundant and widespread bumblebee that has now severely declined to really just a small number of remnant populations. So either a local population extinction or extirpation or full species extinction certainly does happen, and many species are at risk of this. So again, what we covered in this video is thinking about the ways in which the ways in which we are changing the environment that might matter for insects, and also some examples of how species might respond, either through adjusting, moving to find new environments, evolving in place, or dying and going extinct, or again through local extirpation. So what you're going to see in the video that follows from David Wagner is a little bit of the evidence that we have for the impacts of stressors and ongoing insect declines.